Plant ecology, they love to talk about this idea of succession, whereby if you have a plot of land, it starts off in the beginning, kind of with little pioneer species, as they call them. We'd probably in the garden call them weeds, and then it grows up into bigger, larger, more mature forms, woody shrubs, and then it becomes a tree. Canopy of dense, thickly wooded trees. And that's the climax, so to speak. So that's the pioneers, that's the climax. So again, there is this trajectory you see of going from kind of small to larger forms and then forming that flat line. If you look at plants though in the garden or in the natural landscape, it doesn't always follow the rules of succession. That's to say the plants could be distributed unevenly throughout space because of all the other varying factors that define a landscape. Whether that be water, sun exposure, facing north, facing south, facing east, the precipitation, the humidity of that year. So if we're looking at a hillside, so if you're looking at a hillside, you might get those patches of grasslands where it's the driest, up high on the ridges maybe, and where the water flows through, that's where you're going to get the willows and the oaks. And up alongside then, of course, all the different shrubbery. And same thing in this canyon. Bigger trees where it's wetter, grasslands, scrublands. Maybe up here in the rocks, you got plants specialized for living in rocks. Weird little succulent things, and so on. So then in this natural system, a fire might sweep through here and char it all up. It might push all those scrub back and then make it into weedy grasslands again. Or in another instance, somebody might put some livestock over here and they'd be munching on that grassland and compacting the soil until it comes in all these other plants, maybe thistles, maybe shrubs and everything. And that would change the vegetation communities also. And if you're able to watch succession over time, you might see some huge changes as we go through geology. Heavy, hard pan clay valleys, water start rushing through it and then them being converted to forests. Or in other cases, maybe you had patches of primeval forest all throughout the place, and over times it got drier and drier. You see them shrinking and shrinking until they were only confined to certain mountaintops where the other places that they once inhabited are no longer hospitable. Another defining vocabulary in plant ecology is competition, where creatures compete against one another to take over a landscape. And two of the primary ones as far as plants are concerned, one of them is for over light. So again then, the big tall thing with a huge old canopy is going to be able to reach up the highest for that light and it's going to be the most successful. And there's also the competition for soil. So the one plant that's sitting here with no neighbors, nobody to compete with it, ideally then, that would be the most successful plant. And it would be saying, okay, all this root space, all this ground, it's all for me. This has this human equivalency in human diagrams where they show the people at the top, the apex predators, the apex, the people way high up, and then everything else down below, the pyramid that supports them all. So they're the very tops. So everybody's like, I want to be the tigers, or I want to be a shark. Nobody ever says, oh, let's be the Washington bacterias, or let's be the Cleveland fungus. The thing about the garden is, while competition is an important force, there's other forces at work that allow us to see the kinds of plant distributions we see. There's the big old tree, but just as often as the big old tree, there's stuff that's hanging on it, epiphytes. So they're getting the light, but they don't gotta be that big. They just gotta be light enough, spored or seeded to get up there and plant themselves. Then there's vines that'll crawl up all through here. And not everybody's that into light is the thing. There's a lot of plants that'll be like, that's fine, I'll live under the shade canopy of you. I just grow some big old leaves so I can get that diffuse light that's coming through the canopy. Not a problem. And any number of ground covers will say the same thing. And the shrub that's a little bit out on the periphery or is getting some part sun, that's happy as can be too. And some plants don't even play this game altogether. They're like, I'm not going to go sit there in the lowlands, compete with y'all for all that soil. I'm gonna go live up high on the mountaintop where nobody else wants to grow. I'll stay short and small and be happy as can be. So the forces of adaptation also play a key in terms of plant distribution. There is competition for nutrients in the soil, but it's not as heavy as you might think. You got your plant here. When you go look at plants in nature, especially if there's a little bit of water, oftentimes you don't find them off by themselves. They're all clustered, all close together, buddy to buddy, root to root. It's because they will go ahead and share. Say this one is a little bit more deep rooted, this ones are shallow rooted. And they'll be like, hey, you can live next to me. We're gonna take care of different strata of the soil. It's not a problem at all. And here's another one, maybe it's medium rooted. And then the roots will be pulling nutrients at different times of the year too. Sometimes they'll be pulling them in the spring, sometimes more in the fall, depending on the plant's growth, depending on what its needs are. So that would be called sharing in plant ecology. So very important in the garden is the relationships that the creatures have one with another. Rather than an apex pyramid where you think you got one or two organisms lording over being supported by everybody else, a better picture might be a web of relationships, where everybody is just a tiny piece of the strand connected to one another. And if you're saying, oh, I want to be the spider, I want to eat all the flies, I'm like, no, no, no. A great majority of natural relationships in the gardens are going to be based on benefits to each other, what the ecologists call mutualisms. The most primary one on earth in the garden is most important is that one between plants and fungus, or plants and bacteria, where you have the plants and their roots, and connected to the roots then are fungus, forming that web all over the earth. The trees and the plants, they will drop bits of themselves as they die, whether it be leaves, whether it be falling down logs. And then the fungus, its job is to recycle and eat all that matter. And in the process of recycling it, it turns it back into nutrients that the plants can then absorb. So it's this process where death and recycling are part of the picture, and it keeps the whole system moving. So in the garden, when you have a person come through here with their backpack leaf blower on, and they've taken all those leaves away, or you have another person here spraying some herbicides, they're keeping the garden clean and neat, but they're depriving the plants of their nutrients. So then the gardener's got to come back later, and they're going to have a bucket with them, and they're going to lay down some fertilizer, or better than fertilizer is if they come with a shovel and they put wheelbarrows and wheelbarrows of amendment to restore that soil fertility. Feed your fungus, feed your plants. The other important mutualistic relationships in the garden are between plants and insects. So you got your bees, you got your flies, you got your butterflies, and you got your flowers. And the flowers, they got tasty, juicy nectar out here. They got protein-rich pollen. The insects are like, yum, yum, let me go collect some of that. And they go here, and then of course they go to visit another flower. And in the process, of course, then you have pollination, you have fertilization, and you can continue your species. If you want to encourage this sort of mutualism and delight in the benefits of this to your garden, then you're going to have to pay attention. You might find a leaf and it's all chewed up. And if you go look close, there's a little gusanito, a little caterpillar, and you got to refrain from killing it, even though it's damaging some of your plants. If you understand that later that's going to transform into a beautiful butterfly. If you got a pond and you see tons of little damselflies flying all around, and the children are delighting in these damselflies, you have to remember where the damselflies, the la mamas, they like to lay their eggs. They like to lay their eggs on the vegetation on the sides of the ponds. So you want to be sure they leave some of that for the damselflies. Otherwise, if you're like, I want to clean, 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 I want this no food damage, you're going to deprive all the kids of the world of all the beautiful things they see. In other cases, you might have a flower that's faded. And after the flower comes the fruit. And the fruits are usually not as pretty. They're usually brown and it looks kind of dead. But the seeds are inside. So again, you'll have to refrain from your natural characteristic to say, hey, I want to get rid of that dead stuff. I think it's ugly. Because then if you keep the seeds and they fall, boom, there's the future right there. Little baby sprouts. And if you're running a botanical garden, then you could do seed exchanges, then you could run a nursery, and then you could have all the beautiful and goodness of a garden. The other mutualistic relationship in the garden is between plants and animals and people. In nature, in terms of plant distribution, animals are primarily responsible for dispersal of those seeds by eating those yummy fruits. So whether you're a monkey or maybe you're an elephant eating a baobab fruit tree, that's your primary role as a disperser. Because then you're going to eat that fruit and lay a bunch of warm, steamy dung, but the seed's going to be inside and the seed's going to grow up into another plant. If you're in the garden, then if you're in the nursery, you're going to take those seeds and plant them in pots. Then whether you can sell them, use them for reforestation, give them away to people that are trying to grow their own food and be a little bit more self-sufficient, and there's a happy place. One more important concept in the study of plant ecology is this idea of different kinds of spaces, the places they interact, and how to connect them all together. In general, they'll call them patches. So you got a patch here, maybe you got another patch here. And maybe you got some kind of a bridge, some kind of corridor, some kind of pathway to connect them. And all along here is different sites also of dynamic activity, what the ecologists love to call the edge. Because this is where it seems like where stuff's interacting, that's where the stuff is happening. Not deep in the interior, but still where the stuff is touching. Not in the places where it's homogeneous, but in the places where one meets another and they're a little bit different. And these patches, they could be forests, they could be wetlands, they could be downriver, upriver. They could be all different things. But the idea is through this connection, then you're going to promote diversity, you're going to promote richness of the landscape. And in general, what we try to avoid is this thing, what they call fragmentation. Where you might imagine everything is all constrained to tiny little boxes, and they all got hard borders, hard edges, and nobody's interacting with another person. And there's no flow, there's no energy, nothing's happening. Rather than a system of a garden where everything's boxed in by walls, you're trying to think of maybe something that looks a little bit more like this. Where everything, every creature, every space is a tiny little sphere of influence, but where they overlap, stuff happens. And maybe there's bigger overlapping circles. So it looks messy and chaotic, but it describes a little bit better what we actually see in nature and what's healthy for the system. So let's go back to the little yard that you're designing. And you're like, what do all these ecological principles have to do with me? I'm just doing my tiny little squat yard that's 25 feet wide by 40 feet long. How do I apply those same principles in the garden? The garden, when you're designing it, you're designing a little microcosm of nature, a little piece of the whole universe. And once you go in there, if it's a beautiful space, you can get lost, you can be in awe. It can be the best, most fun place in your life. So it's worthwhile to put a little thought, a little bit of care into the design of this landscape, the design of this yard. You might endeavor to think of the butterflies. So in a little piece of the yard, whether you plant some host plants or leave some host plants be, leave some damaged plants intact so that you can see the butterflies. In a sunny corner, you might endeavor to put in some raised beds and plant some food. That way you have the joy of the harvest, but then more fun in the joy of harvest is the joy of sharing it and eating it together, whether with just your family or with the neighbors, with anybody else that don't mind to partake of nature's bountifulness. In this section, you might have a bunch of shrubs and flowers, bulbs, maybe stuff that you can make cut flowers of, some flowers that are fragrant, some flowers that light up the whole yard. And if you get really into it, replenish the soil, your homegrown food. Maybe in the back you have a little chicken coop, or you raise some birds. Here in San Francisco, the legal limit is 4 animals, so you can have 4 birds, no roosters. There is no end result of the garden. The garden is a process that you continually engage in. It's a complex matrices of natural and living things that you're going to interact with. And the idea is then these borders, these tiny little 6 foot tall, 8 foot tall fences, there's porous. There's a lot of connectivity that helps to break up that fragmentation that you feel And from this tiny little garden space, then you'll reach out into all of nature and all of the universe, and hopefully find some kind of content.